On a summer night in 1943, the radar operators defending one of Germany's great cities were staring at the impossible. Their screens, which had reliably tracked incoming aircraft for years, had suddenly gone mad. Instead of the familiar handful of blips marking a bomber stream, there were now thousands of contacts, a blizzard of false targets filling every corner of the display. It looked as though tens of thousands of aircraft had appeared out of nowhere, far more than existed in the world. The operators could not tell the real bombers from the phantoms. Their entire air defense system, the pride of a technologically advanced nation, had been rendered useless in an instant. And the weapon that did it was so simple you could hold it in your hand. It was nothing but strips of paper backed with metal foil. This is the story of one of the most elegant weapons ever conceived. A countermeasure so cheap, so simple, and so devastating that it changed the air war and the entire future of electronic combat. It required no explosives, no engines, no precision machinery. It was, quite literally, just metallic strips cut to the right length and dumped out of an aircraft by the bundle. And yet this humble material defeated one of the most sophisticated defensive systems of the war, blinding the radar that had cost countless bomber crews their lives. It is the perfect proof that in warfare, the most powerful idea is sometimes the simplest one. To understand how a handful of foil could defeat a nation's air defenses, you first have to understand the technology it was designed to beat. Radar was one of the defining inventions of the era, a genuine revolution in warfare. Before radar, defenders had to rely on human eyes and ears to detect approaching aircraft, which meant they often had little warning, especially at night or in poor weather. Radar changed everything. By sending out radio waves and listening for the echoes that bounced back off solid objects, a radar station could detect aircraft at great distances, in darkness, through clouds, and could direct defending fighters and anti-aircraft guns to intercept them with deadly precision. For the bomber crews flying into enemy territory, radar was a terrifying adversary. It meant that the defenders knew they were coming. It guided night fighters to find them in the dark. It aimed the anti-aircraft guns that filled the sky with deadly fire. The defensive network that radar made possible was a sophisticated, layered system, with stations tracking the bombers, controllers coordinating the defense, and fighters and guns directed onto the incoming aircraft. For the attackers, getting through this gauntlet was a matter of life and death, and far too often, death won. Losses among bomber crews were horrendous, and the radar-guided defenses were a major reason why. So the great challenge for the attacking air forces became finding a way to defeat the enemy's radar. And here, the scientists and engineers working on the problem made a crucial realization about how radar actually functioned. Radar works by detecting the reflections of radio waves off objects. An aircraft reflects those waves because it is made of metal of a certain size. But an aircraft is not the only thing that can reflect radio waves. Anything metallic of the appropriate dimensions will bounce the signal back and create an echo on the radar screen. And this opened up an astonishing possibility. What if you could flood the sky with millions of small reflective objects, each one creating its own false echo, until the radar screen was so full of contacts that the real aircraft were completely hidden among them? This was the principle behind the weapon. The idea was to cut strips of metal foil to a specific length, a length carefully matched to the wavelength of the enemy's radar, because a strip of that particular size would reflect those radio waves with maximum effect. These strips, bundled together in enormous quantities and released from aircraft, would spread out into a vast cloud drifting in the air. Each individual strip was a tiny radar reflector, and a single bundle contained thousands of them. Released in sufficient numbers, they created an overwhelming mass of false echoes, a fog of phantom contacts that swamped the enemy's screens and made it impossible to pick out the actual bombers hidden within the cloud. Now we should be honest about the history here, because this is a true and well-documented story. Though we will keep the technical specifics general, the weapon was developed in secret, and remarkably, it was developed independently by more than one nation at roughly the same time, because the underlying principle was discoverable by any sufficiently advanced scientific effort. And this led to one of the strangest features of the weapon's history. For a long time, both sides hesitated to actually use it, even though they had discovered it. The reason was a kind of mutual fear. Each side realized that if it deployed this countermeasure, it would reveal the secret to the enemy, who could then turn the very same weapon against its own radar defenses. It was a secret so powerful that its possessors were almost afraid to unleash it. Think about the strategic dilemma that created. A nation might possess a weapon capable of crippling its enemy's air defenses, and yet hold back from using it, terrified that doing so would teach the enemy to cripple its own defenses in return. Both sides sat on the secret, each one aware of it, each one afraid to be the first to open this particular box. It is a fascinating glimpse into the strange calculations of war, where the decision to use a weapon depends not just on what it can do to the enemy, but on what the enemy might then do to you. The foil strips were a loaded gun that both sides were afraid to fire. Eventually, the decision was made to use the weapon when the advantage of crippling the enemy's defenses was judged to outweigh the risk of the secret being turned around. And when it was finally deployed on a large scale, the effect was everything its inventors had hoped for and more. As the bombers approached their target, they began releasing the bundles of foil. The strips fluttered out into the night sky, spreading into a growing cloud of metallic confetti. And on the ground, the enemy's radar operators watched in helpless astonishment as their screens dissolved into chaos. The careful, orderly picture of the air situation that they relied upon was replaced by an impenetrable storm of false contacts. The consequences for the defense were catastrophic. The radar-guided system that had taken such a fearful toll on the bomber crews suddenly could not function. The night fighters, which depended on being guided to their targets, were now being directed toward phantoms, chasing echoes that did not exist while the real bombers slipped through. The anti-aircraft guns, which relied on radar to aim accurately in the dark, lost their precision and fired blindly. The whole sophisticated apparatus of the defense, built up over years at enormous expense, was thrown into disarray by strips of foil that cost almost nothing to produce. For the bomber crews who had faced near certain peril on every mission, this was a lifeline, a way to reach their targets and return home with far better odds of survival. There is a profound lesson in this, one that recurs throughout the history of technology and warfare. The most advanced and complex systems often have surprisingly simple vulnerabilities. The enemy had invested enormously in their radar network, pouring resources and brilliance into a cutting-edge technology. But the very sophistication of the system was, in a sense, its weakness, because it depended entirely on receiving clean, interpretable signals. Corrupt those signals with a flood of noise, and the whole elaborate structure became worthless. The defenders had built a magnificent machine, and a handful of foil strips jammed it completely. Complexity, for all its power, can be brittle, and sometimes the cheapest, crudest attack is the one that brings it down. This principle that you can defeat a sensor not by destroying it but by overwhelming it with false information became one of the foundational ideas of an entirely new field of warfare. The foil strips were among the first major weapons in what would become the vast domain of electronic warfare, the ongoing struggle to deceive, jam, and defeat the enemy's electronic systems. From that night onward, every advance in detection technology would be met by a corresponding advance in countermeasures, and every countermeasure by a countermeasure in an endless technological duel that continues to this day. The simple strips of foil were the opening move in a contest that has shaped warfare ever since. Consider, too, the beautiful economy of the weapon. War is usually a contest of expensive things, of costly aircraft, and elaborate machines and resources poured out on a massive scale. But here was a weapon that cost almost nothing, and yet neutralized a defensive system worth a fortune. The exchange was absurdly lopsided in the attacker's favor. For the price of some metallic strips, they could render useless the radar stations, the trained operators, the guided fighters, and the aimed guns that the enemy had invested years and immense wealth in building. There is a kind of poetry in that imbalance, the cheapest possible material defeating the most expensive possible system. It is the ultimate expression of fighting smart rather than fighting expensive. It would be a mistake to imagine that this weapon won the air war single-handedly, or that it remained effective forever without complication. The enemy was not helpless, and over time they developed techniques and technologies to mitigate the effects of the foil, to filter the noise and adapt their methods. The duel between jamming and detection went back and forth as such duels always do, but the introduction of this countermeasure was a genuine turning point, a moment when the balance of the air war shifted, when the deadly effectiveness of the radar-guided defense was broken, and when countless bomber crews gained a far better chance of surviving their missions. By every serious account, this simple weapon had an enormous and immediate impact. What makes this story so compelling is the gap between the simplicity of the means and the magnitude of the effect. We expect powerful weapons to be impressive, complex, and intimidating, but the foil strips were none of those things. They were humble, almost laughably crude, the kind of thing you might dismiss as too simple to matter. And yet, they accomplished what no amount of brute force could easily achieve. They blinded an entire defensive network and saved the lives of crews who would otherwise have been shot from the sky. It is a humbling reminder that effectiveness in war is not about how impressive a weapon looks, but about how cleverly it exploits the enemy's weaknesses. The scientists and engineers who developed this weapon deserve our immense credit, not for building something powerful in the conventional sense, but for understanding something profound about how the enemy's technology worked and where it was vulnerable. They did not try to outbuild the enemy's radar or destroy it with force. They studied it, understood its fundamental principle, and found the elegant flaw that would defeat it. That is a different kind of genius from the genius of raw engineering. It is the genius of insight, of seeing to the heart of a problem and finding the simplest possible solution. And it changed the course of the air war. By the time the war ended, this simple countermeasure had earned its place in the history of military technology, and its descendants would go on to shape every conflict that followed. The basic idea, born from cutting strips of foil to the right length, evolved into the sophisticated electronic warfare systems that fill the skies of modern conflict. But the principle remains exactly the same as it was on that summer night in 1943 when the radar screens first filled with phantom contacts. You do not always have to destroy the enemy's eyes. Sometimes it is enough, and far cheaper, simply to fill them with so much false vision that they can no longer see the truth. So the next time you marvel at some piece of advanced technology, remember the strips of foil that defeated a nation's radar. Remember that the most sophisticated system can be undone by the simplest idea, that complexity can be fragile, and that a clever mind studying a hard problem can find a solution so elegant it seems almost like cheating. The bombers flew through skies made safer not by bigger guns or faster aircraft, but by metallic confetti drifting on the night air. And in that drifting cloud of foil lay one of the great truths of warfare, that the cheapest weapon, used wisely, can defeat the most expensive defense.